had been studied ever since the 1950s, 60s, and there was a large team working here until 1989. And then the world changed, archaeology stopped here, and people who was making the archaeologists in Ajaria work in Gonyo. But my colleague Amir Kakhidze was didn't approve of this. He wanted to work again at Pictionary, but the problem was raising the money. And he asked me if I would collaborate with him as a co-director on a new excavation activity at Pictionary. And at first I said, well, it's going to be a big problem. Where do you get the money from? But then I found it was incredibly easy to raise money for an excavation like this. And over the years, I worked here with Amiran for 13 years, from 1998 to 2010. And I reckon that the Oxford element in this activity contributed something like $100,000 to the local economy as a result of this collaboration. And we worked here very happily with Georgian archaeologists, Georgian students, and students from England and elsewhere, working very harmoniously together. And and what we were finding was somehow a foretaste of this sort of collaboration, in that in the area where we're standing in now, there wasn't just one cemetery, a Greek cemetery. There was a cemetery of Greek immigrants, but there was a Colchian cemetery further over there, where the local population were buried. It had different burial customs, and it's relatively easy to tell the difference between Colchian and Greek burials for the most part. And they were certainly were buried side by side without any apparent sign of conflict between them. And it looks as though the Greek immigrants were welcomed to this part of the world by the local inhabitants, just as the how can I put it, the visiting archaeologists from elsewhere, from outside Georgia, were welcomed by the Georgian archaeologists. As I say, we worked here harmoniously for 13 years. As I say, we worked here for 13 years, but the results of our excavations have been published in a series of monographs on Pictionary, and they have been responsible for spreading the word about Pictionary around the world. Archaeological libraries will all have copies of these volumes. About 7 Pictionary volumes have been published so far, and they have all the information about the excavation. And
museum you can also add.
And the museum in Batumi contains the finds from the excavation here, and they're beautifully exhibited in the upstairs gallery in Batumi. But the point I really want to make is that this site is very important, and there is more to be found. And if the site is stripped by how can I put it, by people developing the land for other purposes, hotels and houses, it'll be a great shame. There'll be so much information lost about the connections between Kolkis, that's Ajaria and Guria, and Mingrelia in antiquity, known as Kolkis. The Kolkians had their own kingdom, had their own highly developed civilization. Look at the finds from Varni, the beautiful gold objects that have been found there, and their connections with the outside world, with the Mediterranean world, have been illustrated in Varni at a very high level of material culture, and here at where you have, as it were, every man, the ordinary people living in a settlement somewhere. We haven't found the settlement yet, but when we do, it'll be very exciting. And we sincerely hope that it will be possible to save as much of this territory as possible for further research and excavation for the next generation to apply perhaps more elegant scientific procedures than we did. Mm-hmm. There are various possibilities. The developers truly are proposing to develop this area. They, I think, these days they're obliged to fund excavation in advance of their development, and that would be one way of dealing with the situation. Another would be to find an institution that's willing to fund another series of annual excavations like the ones we had, but that's less likely these days. It's difficult to imagine anyone stepping in very easily. So I think the best way of handling it would be using the existing legislation for encourage, not just encourage, but to insist that developers pay for scientific investigation archaeologically of the site before they go in with their bulldozers and cement mixers.